My name is Arthur, 67 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent a lifetime constructing foundations intended to endure. I always believed I had established an unshakable foundation for my son, Lachlan. I was walking toward his ground-floor apartment in the inner-city suburb of South Bank, Melbourne, carrying a heavy leather portfolio containing the final legal documents. These papers authorized the transfer of 900,000 Australian dollars, a sum intended to allow Lachlan and his wife, Chloe, to finally purchase their dream home. As I approached their open patio door, I paused, intending to surprise them. However, the conversation drifting through the glass shattered the reality I had built for myself. Chloe was not using the gentle, polite tone she reserved for our Sunday lunches. Her voice was sharp, fast, and intensely calculating. She was speaking to her brother, laying out a plan that chilled me to the bone. She explained that I was finally bringing the money that afternoon, and she instructed him to have the legal paperwork for their secretly formed limited liability company prepared immediately. She stated with cold precision that once the funds cleared, the property title would be registered exclusively under her family's company, leaving Lachlan with no equity in the home. My $900,000 was not being gifted to my son. It was being harvested by her family. I felt a sickening sensation in my stomach, like a load-bearing column failing under unexpected pressure. Yet, the betrayal deepened. Chloe leaned against their kitchen counter, visible through the blinds, and mentioned that they had finalized the arrangements for my living situation. She told her brother that Lachlan had finally consented to the plan. Once the house was secured, they intended to legally force me into a state-run aged care facility located out by the regional highway. She casually suggested they would inform the medical staff that I was suffering from early-stage dementia and memory loss, describing my presence in their lives as a tiresome nuisance that needed to be managed. I stood motionless, the portfolio feeling like a lead weight in my hand. Then I heard the heavy footsteps of my son entering the kitchen. I prayed for Lachlan to defend me, to remind his wife of the sacrifices I had made, but his reaction was one of mild, exhausting indifference. He told her that dealing with me had become a burden and that he agreed with the decision to secure their future at any cost. In that moment, the bond between father and son, built over decades of shared construction sites and hard work, completely severed. The man I had raised had vanished, replaced by a stranger standing in a kitchen, calmly discussing the theft of my life's work and the erasure of my independence. I did not confront them. Decades of engineering taught me that when a structure is critically compromised, you do not strike it with a hammer. You step back, assess the failure, and prepare for controlled demolition. I turned away, stepping silently onto the gravel, and walked back to my truck, my mind rapidly transitioning from shock to a cold, unwavering focus. I climbed into the driver's seat of my utility truck and locked the doors, creating a physical barrier between myself and the betrayal I had just witnessed. My hands, which had navigated the blueprints for some of Melbourne's tallest commercial towers, were steady as I opened the leather portfolio. Inside lay the bank check for $900,000, the culmination of 12 years of relentless work following the passing of my wife. I looked at the document, not as a gift, but as a dangerous instrument in the hands of those who sought to dismantle my autonomy. With deliberate movements, I tore the check into small, unusable pieces, followed by the trust documents. I felt no remorse, only the clarity of a structural engineer identifying a critical failure in a design. I started the engine and drove directly toward my primary bank branch in the heart of the Melbourne Central Business District. I knew that if Lachlan and Chloe were prepared to misrepresent my mental health to commit financial theft, they would likely attempt to access my other accounts. Upon entering the bank, I bypassed the general teller line and requested an immediate private meeting with the branch manager, a professional I had dealt with for over 15 years. I instructed him to freeze all my accounts, revoke any outgoing electronic wire privileges, and implement a mandatory in-person verification protocol for every single dollar I possessed. As the manager processed these security overrides, his movements suddenly ceased. He turned his monitor toward me, his expression visibly pale. On the screen, I saw that less than an hour earlier, while I was driving to the apartment in South Bank, an electronic request had been submitted to wire $300,000 from my secondary savings account to an unknown corporate entity. Attached to the request was a temporary medical power of attorney. It was a document I had signed 3 years prior during a minor knee replacement surgery intended solely for emergency hospital admissions. Lachlan had retained this document and was actively attempting to drain my assets before I even arrived at their home. The realization was absolute. They were not merely waiting for the $900,000. They were systematically looting my estate. The conflict had shifted from a family matter to a criminal one. I thanked the manager, left the branch, and drove toward the offices on Collins Street to find Aaron Fletcher. As a seasoned estate attorney, Aaron understood the architecture of wealth better than anyone I knew. I needed to move beyond the shock and begin the controlled demolition of the trap they had set for me. I was no longer a father being victimized. I was a professional calculating the exact points of vulnerability in a failing structure. I pulled into a parking space, took a deep, steadying breath, and prepared to ensure that those who had sought to build their future on the ruins of my life would find that the ground beneath them was no longer solid. The heavy oak door of Aaron Fletcher's office on Collins Street clicked shut, sealing out the relentless noise of Melbourne's afternoon traffic. I sat in the high-backed leather chair across from his desk, resting my hands flat on the polished mahogany surface. The office smelled of archival paper and bitter, cold coffee. Aaron, a man who had navigated the architecture of my family's wealth for 2 decades, adjusted his glasses, his pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. He sensed the shift in my posture immediately. The accommodating father who had walked in months ago was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a structural engineer. For 40 years, I had made my living analyzing the integrity of steel and concrete, paid to detect invisible stress fractures in load-bearing columns before they caused a catastrophic collapse. Sitting there, I realized my family was no longer a home. It was a condemned building. Lachlan and Chloe were not my children anymore, but a critical structural failure, and I was the only one in possession of the blueprints. Aaron asked what had happened to the planned trust transfer, expecting, perhaps, a story of a missed appointment or a change of heart. I did not offer a warm greeting or any paternal grief. Instead, I laid out the facts with the detached precision of a site inspection report. I detailed the conversation I had overheard through the patio door in South Bank. The malicious plan to funnel the $900,000 into a limited liability company and the premeditated decision to have me falsely declared incompetent to facilitate my removal to an aged care facility. As I spoke, Aaron's professional composure faltered. His eyes widened, and he let out a slow, heavy breath. He had known Lachlan since he was a teenager, and the gravity of the betrayal clearly disturbed him. When he attempted to offer condolences, I stopped him mid-sentence. I was not there for sympathy. I was there for a tactical assessment. I reached into my coat pocket and produced the printed alert I had secured from the bank manager earlier that day. I slid the document across the desk. Aaron scanned the details of the attempted $300,000 wire transfer executed via the outdated medical power of attorney. He stared at the paper, his legal mind rapidly calculating the severity of the offense. He confirmed that attempting to weaponize an expired medical document for personal financial gain was textbook elder fraud, a serious felony. He advised that we involve the Australian Federal Police immediately. I shook my head, however. Calling the authorities now would only trigger an emotional dispute where Chloe would inevitably play the victim. I did not want them to scatter. I wanted them to step fully into the trap. If you intend to demolish a structure safely, you do not simply throw explosives at the walls. You plant them at the points of maximum vulnerability and wait for gravity to do the rest. I instructed Aaron to conduct a comprehensive stealth audit of every financial perimeter I had established, preparing to give them exactly what they asked for, hidden within a financial Trojan horse that would dismantle their entire world. Aaron turned toward his dual monitors and began typing with the practiced efficiency of a man who managed the complexities of generational wealth. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard filled the quiet office as he accessed the master ledger of my estate. We were not merely reviewing numbers. We were analyzing the entire architecture of my adult life, mapped out in columns and rows. He opened the primary commercial trust file first, the largest repository of the wealth I had accumulated over 4 decades. Staring at that figure, I felt no sense of pride, only the phantom ache in my lower back and the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. After my wife passed away 12 years ago, my world had collapsed. Some men sought comfort in distractions, but I turned to the uncompromising discipline of concrete and steel. I took on the most demanding high-risk structural engineering contract across Victoria and New South Wales. I oversaw the construction of massive suspension bridges and 60-story commercial towers in the Melbourne city centre. I worked through freezing winter rains and blistering summer heat, breathing in silica dust and sleeping in temporary site trailers just to remain close to the projects. I missed holidays and sacrificed vacations. Every dollar in that primary trust was earned through physical endurance, brutal negotiations, and unforgiving deadlines. I had built an impenetrable financial fortress, driven by the belief that the world was a dangerous place and that my son should never face the kind of precarious poverty that kept a man awake at night. Aaron clicked out of the primary trust and opened the historical transfer logs. The screen filled with years of outgoing transactions, each one a glaring testament to my fatal flaw as a parent. Line by line, the digital audit revealed the stark contrast between how I had built my life and how Lachlan had chosen to exist. I had believed in digging deep and pouring a solid foundation before erecting a single wall. Lachlan had believed in skipping the labor to move straight into the penthouse. The banking records detailed the $50,000 I had transferred when he was 25 to fund a technology startup that folded within 6 months. Below, there was the $80,000 bridge loan I provided when he attempted to renovate a residential property in the inner suburbs without hiring a proper inspector. He had ignored the rotting floor joists to save on costs, and when the project went bankrupt, I quietly covered his losses to protect his credit score. As Aaron scrolled through the endless list of bailouts and finalized debt settlements, a sickening realization washed over me. The evidence was undeniable. I had not been protecting my son. I had been systematically eroding his ability to survive in the real world. Every time he took a reckless shortcut, I was there to pave the road beneath his feet. I had taught him that failure held no consequences as long as I was alive to provide the capital. He never learned the value of a dollar because he never had a labor for one. Watching the cursor move down the screen, I understood precisely why he felt no remorse about the conversation I had overheard on the patio in South Bank. In his mind, my wealth was not an asset I had earned. It was a resource awaiting harvest. The attempt to use my old medical records to seize my savings was not a sudden act of desperation, but the logical escalation of a lifetime of entitlement. He had spent his adulthood choosing the path of least resistance, and locking me in an aged care facility was simply the final, most efficient shortcut of them all. Aaron stopped scrolling. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard ceased abruptly, and he leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he focused on a specific subfolder. It was the secondary joint account I had established 5 years ago, intended strictly as an emergency fund for Lachlan and Chloe in case of unforeseen medical crises or severe professional instability. I had rarely checked the balance, trusting them to honor the sacred purpose of that safety net. Aaron pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and let out a low, sharp breath. The audit had moved past my historical failures as a father and had reached the live wire of their current, active deception. He clicked the mouse, and the screen transitioned to the secondary account logs. I had deposited $100,000 into this fund shortly after their wedding, providing very explicit, narrow instructions. It was to remain untouched unless catastrophe struck, a major illness, job loss, or a structural emergency with their living arrangements. I wanted them to sleep soundly, knowing that if they ever faced a genuine bottom, they would not be left without support. I had not monitored the balance in over 3 years, confident in the respect I assumed they held for my hard-earned resources. But the number staring back at us was not the original $100,000 plus interest. The balance read a mere $38,000. My chest tightened, not from the financial loss, but from the realization that my perimeter had been breached long before I stood on that patio in South Bank. Aaron began filtering the transaction history, organizing the withdrawals by date and amount. If Lachlan had lost his job, or if there had been a legitimate medical emergency, I would have been the first to know. There had been no calls for help, no transparency. I leaned into the glow of the monitor, my eyes scanning the rows of data with the cold precision of a site inspector looking for the source of a leak. The theft had not been a single, bold wire transfer that would have triggered a fraud alert. It was a slow, methodical, and deliberate siphoning of funds. A calculated bleed designed to go unnoticed by a man they assumed was too trusting or perhaps too intellectually diminished to verify his own ledgers. I asked Aaron to isolate the merchant names associated with the routing. Numbers. The screen refreshed, replacing vague banking codes with the exact destinations of my stolen money. The evidence of Chloe's hidden life materialized before my eyes. The funds I had endured years of physical sacrifice to secure for their genuine survival had been systematically liquidated to construct a counterfeit image of prosperity. There were recurring monthly payments of $900 to a luxury automotive leasing company for the European vehicle she drove, the same car she claimed her real estate brokerage had provided as a company perk. There were substantial charges for boutique designer clothing stores in the Melbourne CBD, high-end cosmetic clinics, and expensive weekend spa retreats she took with her friends. I watched the cursor highlight a charge for $4,000 at a custom jewelry studio dated just 2 weeks before my last birthday. She had purchased a diamond tennis bracelet for herself using my emergency medical fund, and then possessed the audacity to hand me a store-bought card, claiming that times were tight. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. She was not stealing out of desperation. She was stealing out of pure, unadulterated vanity. She treated my life's work as her personal slush fund, swiping the debit card linked to that account with absolute impunity. Lachlan either knew about it and lacked the integrity to intervene, or he was so remarkably oblivious to his own household finances that she had managed to hide a significant secondary income from him entirely. Knowing my son, it was likely the latter. He had always been too indifferent to the details. Aaron calculated the total sum of unauthorized withdrawals over the past 36 months. The number flashed at the bottom of the screen in bright red: $62,000. Chloe had stolen $62,000 from a man she was actively plotting to commit to a state-run aged care facility. The office went silent. The discovery had fundamentally changed the architecture of my retaliation. This was no longer just about protecting assets, but about neutralizing a predator. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the city's evening energy filtering through the windows of the Collins Street high-rise. Aaron took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a rare display of genuine exhaustion. He had spent his entire career untangling the messy, often greedy disputes of wealthy families, but the brazen nature of this theft seemed to leave even him at a loss for words. He looked up at me, likely expecting to see a man broken by the weight of a daughter-in-law's cruelty. Instead, he found only a cold, hard clarity. This discovery had fundamentally altered the architecture of my retaliation. Before this moment, my goal had simply been to safeguard my remaining assets and sever ties with an ungrateful son. Now, the $62,000 changed the equation entirely. This was no longer just about Lachlan's passive entitlement or his cowardly agreement to commit me to a facility. This was about a predator who had actively infiltrated my family, drained my resources, and was now preparing for a final, fatal strike against my freedom. I stared at the red number on the screen until it was burned into my retinas. Every dollar of that $62,000 represented an hour of my life I would never recover. It represented the weekends I spent pouring concrete in the freezing rain instead of being at home. She had stolen my time, my labor, and my legacy. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Melbourne skyline. I observed the buildings, some of which I had helped design, standing immovable against the wind. A good engineer knows that when you find a parasite destroying the wood, you do not simply patch the hole. You exterminate the threat and ensure the colony collapses. I turned back to Aaron, who sat with his hands folded over the keyboard, awaiting my command. I instructed him to print every page of the transaction history, highlighting every designer purchase, every spa retreat, and every illicit lease payment. I wanted it all bound in a single, undeniable physical document. The $62,000 was no longer just stolen money. It was the exact price of her admission into the trap we were about to construct. The financial autopsy was complete. We had identified the cause of this family's terminal decline. Now, it was time to prepare the burial. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp vibration of my mobile phone against the polished mahogany desk. The caller ID illuminated the screen. Chloe. Aaron looked at the phone, then at me, a silent question passing between us. Minutes earlier, we had uncovered proof that she had systematically robbed my medical fund to finance a life of vanity. And now she was calling the very man she was actively plundering, likely to secure the final $900,000 before finalizing my incarceration. I did not hesitate. I pressed the speakerphone button and held an index finger to my lips, signaling Aaron to remain silent. When I spoke, my voice carried none of the cold fury freezing my veins. Instead, I carefully engineered my tone to sound weary, slightly disoriented, and overwhelmingly eager to please. I performed the exact role she had assigned to me in her arrogant mind. I greeted her with a slight waver in my breath, asking how her afternoon was progressing. Her response echoed through the office, dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that made my stomach churn. She called me Dad, a title she had absolutely no right to use, and asked if I was feeling well. She claimed that she and Lachlan were concerned about me living alone in my house, hoping to finalize the real estate paperwork so they could settle down and finally have me over for Sunday dinners. It was a masterful performance of manipulation, spoken with the smooth cadence of a predator, entirely unaware that the man on the other end of the line possessed a printed ledger of her theft. Chloe initiated the pivot with practiced ease. The saccharine concern dissolved into a manufactured sense of urgency as she let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. She claimed that their real estate agent had just delivered distressing news. The sellers of the suburban home they coveted had received a sudden, all-cash offer from an out-of-state investor. She insisted that unless they could produce the $900,000 by the end of the week, the sellers would withdraw from the agreement. She urged me to expedite the funds immediately. I looked at Aaron across the desk. He rolled his eyes, recognizing the oldest real estate deception in the book. There was no competing buyer. There was only Chloe, desperate to secure my capital before her brother finalized the fraudulent limited liability company they had engineered to strip Lachlan of any equity in the property. I kept my voice perfectly steady, injecting just enough uncertainty to make her believe her tactic was succeeding. I apologized for the delay and asked what steps we needed to take next. Sensing my total compliance, she pressed harder, lowering her voice into a tone of sorrowful desperation. She stated that if they lost this house, Lachlan would be absolutely devastated. She argued that the housing market in Melbourne had become prohibitively expensive, and if this deal failed, they would have no choice but to relocate across the country to find something affordable. Then came the ultimate threat, delivered with cold precision. She mentioned it would break her heart if they had to move so far away, as it would mean I would never witness my future grandchildren grow up. She was weaponizing my legacy against me, dangling the promise of family like a lure in front of a starving animal, all while secretly plotting to commit me to a locked medical ward the moment my funds cleared the bank. I closed my eyes, absorbing the profound depths of her cruelty. A weak man would have collapsed under the emotional weight. A foolish man would have screamed at her, demanding his money back. I did neither. I leaned closer to the microphone and provided the exact response she desired. I told her not to worry, that I would never permit them to lose their dream home, and that I would personally ensure the $900,000 was in their possession by tomorrow evening. The relief in her voice was palpable. She thanked me profusely, calling me the greatest father in the world, and promised to bake my favorite dessert for our dinner meeting. I confirmed the arrangement and disconnected the call. The silence that followed in Aaron's office felt sterile and heavy. Aaron remarked that she was a terrifyingly adept liar. I looked at the dark screen of my phone and corrected him. She was a greedy liar, and greed inevitably creates massive structural blind spots. I turned my attention back to Aaron and delivered my final instructions for the day. I commanded him to scrap the standard family trust transfer documents we had previously prepared. I wanted the $900,000 drawn directly from the corporate reserves of my primary commercial engineering firm, Carter Holdings. I instructed him to draft the transfer not as a personal family gift, but as a heavily restricted, high-interest corporate bridge loan. I wanted the contract buried under layers of dense, technical commercial real estate jargon that Chloe, in her arrogant rush to seize the capital, would never bother to read. I told Aaron to embed specific, lethal legal tripwires into the fabric of the contract. The funds had to be strictly designated for the purchase of a primary residential property under Lachlan's name only. I mandated a clause stating that if the money were deposited into any unregistered shell company, or if the property title were altered in any way to exclude my son after the funds were released, the contract would automatically trigger an immediate default. Furthermore, it would classify the transaction as an act of commercial embezzlement. By structuring the transfer this way, we were removing the impending dispute from the realm of a messy civil court and elevating it into the unforgiving jurisdiction of federal banking authorities and corporate fraud investigators. She believed she was outsmarting a frail old man. I was ensuring she would be legally defrauding a multi-million-dollar holding company with a zero-tolerance policy for theft. Aaron nodded, the brutal brilliance of the plan setting into motion. The bait was no longer just an easily acquired stack of cash. It was a steel-jawed trap disguised as a victory. I parked my truck a block away from the apartment building in South Bank. I needed the short walk to properly adjust my physical posture. For the last 40 years, I had walked with the rigid, upright bearing of a man accustomed to commanding active construction sites. Tonight, I needed to dismantle that image. I rolled my shoulders forward, allowing my spine to curve slightly. I slowed my pace, dragging my left foot just a fraction of an inch against the pavement. I allowed my expression to go slack, softening the hard lines around my jaw. By the time I reached their front door, I was no longer Arthur, the structural engineer who had engineered their financial ruin. I was exactly who they wanted me to be, a frail, tired old man whose mind was slowly slipping into the fog of early-stage cognitive decline. I knocked on the door with a light, hesitant tap. Chloe swung it open almost instantly. The scent of roasted chicken and freshly baked apple pie drifted out from the kitchen. She was wearing a perfectly pressed floral dress, her face glowing with a manufactured smile that belonged on a television commercial. She reached out and grabbed my arms, pulling me into a tight, dramatic embrace. She told me how wonderful it was to see me and how much she had looked forward to this dinner. I patted her back with trembling hands, playing the part of the grateful father-in-law. I stepped inside and saw Lachlan standing by the dining table, pouring wine into expensive crystal glasses, glasses I now knew had been purchased with money stolen from my emergency medical fund. Lachlan looked up and offered a tight, nervous smile. He asked how I was feeling. I did not provide a sharp, articulate answer. Instead, I paused, looking around the room as if slightly disoriented. I took off my coat and fumbled with the buttons, letting my fingers shake just enough to be noticeable. I asked him what day it was, claiming I had somehow lost track of the week. The look that passed between Lachlan and Chloe was instantaneous. It was a look of smug validation. They genuinely believed my mind was failing. They believed their plan to commit me to a state-run aged care facility was not just a cold necessity, but entirely justified by my apparent decline. Chloe gently took my coat, speaking to me in the slow, loud-voiced people reserved for toddlers or the deeply impaired. She guided me to the head of the table, treating me like a fragile piece of glass that might shatter at any moment. I sat down and let out a long, exaggerated sigh, rubbing my temples. I told them I was just so exhausted lately and that maintaining my own house had become far too much for me to handle. Chloe placed a plate of hot food in front of me, her eyes shining with absolute greed. She touched my shoulder and told me not to worry about a single thing. She promised that once they closed on the new house, everything would be easier. She said they would take complete care of me, and I would never have to stress about my living situation again. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She was feeding me a warm meal while mentally measuring me for a straitjacket. I picked up my fork and ate the food, making sure to chew slowly and intentionally drop a small piece of potato onto my shirt. Lachlan watched me do it, and I saw the distinct flash of disgust cross his face. My own son was repulsed by the weakness he thought he was witnessing. He took a large sip of his expensive wine, completely failing to realize that the weakness was a perfectly constructed illusion. Internally, my mind was operating with the cold, razor-sharp precision of a steel trap waiting to spring. I cataloged every piece of evidence, every lie, and every patronizing smile. As the dinner progressed, I continued to feed their arrogance. I spoke about how confusing banking had become and how difficult it was to read the fine print on legal documents. I handed them every excuse they needed to feel completely secure in their theft. The more helpless I acted, the more confident they became. Chloe poured me a glass of water, her hand brushing against the thick leather folder I had placed on the empty chair beside me. She asked what was inside, her voice trembling with barely contained excitement. I looked at the folder and then back at her, putting on a soft, bewildered smile. I told her I had brought the paperwork for the house, just as she had requested. I explained that I wanted to ensure they secured their dream home before my memory deteriorated any further. Lachlan finally looked me directly in the eyes, his guilt momentarily warring with his greed, but the greed won instantly. He told me I was doing the right thing and that this was the best move for our family's future. He had fully convinced himself that stealing my capital and my freedom was an act of mercy. The plates were cleared, and Chloe brought out the apple pie she had promised. She cut a massive slice and placed it carefully in front of me, the celebratory dessert for a victory they thought they had already achieved. The atmosphere was thick with their unspoken triumph. They believed they had successfully manipulated a fading old man into handing over the keys to his kingdom. They had no idea that the frail man sitting at their dining table had already rewritten the deed to their destruction. I took a slow, deliberate bite of the pie. The dinner of deception had served its purpose. They were completely relaxed, entirely disarmed, and utterly blind to the steel jaws resting silently beneath the surface. It was time to hand them the bait. I finished the last bite and carefully set my fork down on the porcelain plate. The clink of the metal against the dish was the only sound in the room. Lachlan and Chloe were staring at me with the focused intensity of starving wolves watching a wounded animal take its final breath. They had played their parts perfectly all evening, and now they were waiting for their reward. I reached a trembling hand toward the thick leather folder. I let my fingers slip off the leather once, pretending my grip was weak and uncoordinated. Chloe actually leaned forward in her seat, her breath hitching slightly. She looked as though she wanted to leap across the table and rip the folder from my hands. I finally grasped the leather cover and pulled it onto my lap. I slowly unzipped the main compartment, letting the harsh metallic sound drag out for as long as possible. The noise seemed to echo in the quiet apartment, amplifying the tension. I looked up at them, playing the role of the devoted father one last time. I told them I was glad I could do this for them. I said I wanted them to have a beautiful, spacious place to build their family far away from the stress and noise of the city. I told them I only wanted to be helpful before I became too much of a burden. I reached inside the folder, and my fingers brushed against the thick premium stock paper of the corporate check. Aaron had drafted it exactly as I had requested that afternoon. It was not a personal check drawn from my private family savings. It was a commercial draft issued directly from the primary operating reserves of Carter Holdings. I slowly pulled the document into the warm yellow light of the dining room chandelier. The paper was crisp and heavy, carrying the undeniable physical weight of nearly $1 million. I slid it across the polished wood of the dining table. I did not push it toward my son. I pushed it directly toward Chloe. She was the architect of my destruction, and I wanted to witness her take the bait with her own hands. She did not even wait for the check to stop moving before she snatched it up. Both of her hands clamped down on the edges of the paper, holding it as if the wind might suddenly blow it away. I sat back and watched the transformation overtake her face. It was a fascinating thing to witness. I watched her eyes lock onto the numbers printed in bold black ink. $900,000. Her pupils dilated instantly, expanding until her eyes appeared almost entirely black, reflecting the light from above. A flush of deep red crept up her neck and spread across her cheeks, the physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated greed flooding her nervous system. She let out a sharp gasp, a sound of raw hunger finally being sated. Her hands began to shake, causing the heavy paper to rattle in the quiet room. She was holding more capital than she had ever seen in her entire life, and the sheer power of it was intoxicating. She was so thoroughly mesmerized by the 9 and the 5 following zeros that she did not look at anything else on the document. She failed to notice the bold corporate logo of Carter Holdings stamped in dark blue ink at the top left, nor did she read the legal memo line at the bottom, which explicitly designated the funds as a heavily restricted commercial bridge loan, subject to strict Australian corporate tax regulations. She saw only the illusion of free money. She traced her perfectly manicured fingernail over the printed amount, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was currently holding a sophisticated financial device. My mind evaluated her reaction with the cold precision of an engineer inspecting a doomed structure. Her greed had created a massive blind spot. If she deposited that specific corporate draft into an unregistered limited liability company, as she had planned with her brother, she would instantly violate multiple federal banking regulations. The moment the routing numbers processed the transaction, an automated corporate fraud alert would trigger. The system would freeze the funds entirely and notify the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, of the attempted embezzlement. She was smiling at a loaded weapon, completely convinced it was a winning lottery ticket. She did not ask a single question about the origin of the check, nor why it lacked the standard appearance of a personal bank draft. Her vanity and absolute confidence in her own intellect had blinded her to the trap resting right in front of her. Lachlan leaned over her shoulder to inspect the paper. He let out a heavy breath of relief and rubbed his hand forcefully over his face. He looked at me, his expression a mix of lingering guilt and overwhelming salvation. He told me I had no idea how much this meant to them or how it would change their lives. He was correct about the change, though not in the way he imagined. It was going to strip away the illusion of their success and expose the rotting foundation beneath them. Chloe looked up from the check, her eyes shining with unshed tears of manufactured joy. She called me an absolute angel and promised she would never forget this incredible moment. I looked directly into her eyes, maintaining my soft, bewildered expression, and offered a slow, tired smile. I told her I knew she would not forget it. This was a day that would remain with her for the rest of her life. I watched her carefully fold the corporate check and slide it into the pocket of her dress, right next to her heart. She patted the pocket once, a gesture of absolute ownership and triumph. The transaction was complete. The bait had been swallowed, and they had officially taken possession of the Trojan horse. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense anticipation to a sickeningly sweet celebration. Lachlan hurried to the kitchen to pour another round of expensive wine, entirely unaware he was toasting to his own criminal implication. Chloe could not stop touching her pocket, constantly verifying that the document remained there. She began talking rapidly about the new furniture she intended to purchase, describing the exact shade of paint she wanted for the master bedroom. She spoke of the sprawling backyard and the massive kitchen island, talking as if I were already a ghost haunting the room. In her mind, I was already gone, packed away in a sterile, white room at an aged care facility, silenced and forgotten. I sat quietly and listened to her describe the empire she planned to build with my labor. I felt no anger. Anger is a chaotic emotion that leads to errors. I felt only the cold, structural permanence of what I had accomplished. I had spent my life building things meant to endure, but tonight, I had engineered a masterpiece of destruction. The check in her pocket was not wealth. It was a digital tracking beacon that would lead investigators directly into the heart of their fraudulent enterprise. The morning of the closing was crisp and bright. The downtown Melbourne offices of the premier title and escrow company occupied the 40th floor of a glass and steel high-rise. I arrived early, positioning myself in the quiet reception area, completely out of their line of sight, to observe the conference room through the frosted glass wall. The room was designed to project an aura of permanence and wealth. At its center sat a massive, polished mahogany table, its dark surface reflecting the warm light of the crystal chandelier. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, marked only by the slow, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that, to my ears, resembled a countdown. Chloe sat at the head of the table, treating the appointment as a coronation. She had dressed with calculated extravagance, wearing a tailored white designer suit that signaled new money. Her hair was meticulously styled, and the diamond tennis bracelet, purchased with funds stolen from my medical reserve, glittered aggressively under the lights. She sat with an aura of smug entitlement, radiating the confidence of a predator seconds away from consuming its final meal. Lachlan sat to her right, wearing the expensive Italian suit I had gifted him the previous year, his posture casual and detached. He had successfully convinced himself that his actions were virtues rather than crimes. He chatted with the title agent, a silver-haired woman with a practiced, professional demeanor, about the skyline view, entirely unbothered by the reality of his betrayal. The title agent began organizing the final paperwork into distinct piles. The slow, deliberate shuffling of the thick, premium stock paper was the only sound competing with the grandfather clock. She placed a silver pen in the center of the table, instructing them to sign the property transfer deed to officially move the title from the sellers into their newly formed family limited liability company. Chloe reached out, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal of the pen. She looked down at the signature line, her chest rising and falling with triumphant breaths. She was moments away from funneling nearly $1 million of corporate capital into a private shell company controlled by her brother, a standard residential real estate transaction on the surface, but a deliberate act of felony fraud in practice. They were insulated within a bubble of absolute arrogance, entirely convinced they had outsmarted a fading old man. They believed the corporate check I had provided at dinner was quietly resting in the escrow accounts, cleared and ready for distribution. They had no idea that the federal banking system had frozen that specific transaction 72 hours ago. They were oblivious to the fact that an automated corporate fraud alert had been processed and that the money they were currently celebrating existed nowhere in the world. They were at the absolute peak of their delusion. Chloe uncapped the silver pen, bringing the tip down until it hovered a fraction of a millimeter above the crisp white paper. She paused, savoring the apex of her ambition. She believed her life was permanently changing for the better, having secured her wealth and eliminated the only human obstacle in her path. She was entirely blind to the fact that the floor beneath her had already been demolished by the very man she thought she had buried. I watched from the shadows of the reception area, feeling the cold, calculated precision of the trap finalizing its grip. I allowed her that final second of perceived supremacy, that intoxicating rush of total victory. Then I stepped forward. I pushed the heavy glass door open, the whoosh of displaced air shattering the quiet sanctity of their manufactured triumph. I walked into the room, and the metallic click of the latch locking behind me echoed with a finality that silenced the grandfather clock. I stood straight, my spine aligned with the rigid perfection of a steel support beam, and looked at them with the eyes of an engineer who had finally arrived to inspect the ruin. The heavy glass doors of the conference room remained closed, but the isolation inside was suffocating. The silver-haired title agent kept her word. She picked up the sleek telephone on her desk and dialed the direct line for building security and the local authorities. Lachlan and Chloe were paralyzed. They sat at the massive mahogany table like stone statues, unable to comprehend the speed at which their lives had been dismantled. The sprawling suburban house with the massive kitchen island ceased to exist, replaced entirely by the reality of imminent arrest. Chloe was slumped against the polished wood, her expensive white designer suit wrinkled and stained with the sweat of terror. She looked at the heavy metal lockbox sitting by the title agent, knowing that every piece of evidence required to send her to federal prison was locked safely inside. Lachlan finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, broken whisper. He asked his wife what they were going to do, expecting the arrogant, manipulative woman who always possessed a plan. But that woman was gone. She stared blankly at the space on the table where the transfer deed used to be. Less than 10 minutes later, the glass door swung open. 2 building security guards, accompanied by 3 police officers from the Melbourne CBD, entered the room. The title agent handed the lockbox to the lead officer and formally identified them as individuals attempting to execute fraudulent commercial wire transfers and felony elder abuse. The officers instructed Lachlan and Chloe to stand and step away from the table. Chloe attempted to protest, using her professional broker voice to frame this as a misunderstanding between a confused father and his children. The officer looked at the official State Real Estate Commission suspension notice and informed her that she was no longer a licensed broker and was required to remain silent. The humiliation was absolute as they were escorted out of the conference room and through the crowded 40th floor reception area. Dozens of real estate professionals and wealthy clients stopped to watch the spectacle. Chloe had built her entire identity around projecting untouchable success. Now, those same people were watching her being marched out by police. Her reputation was publicly executed. The officers escorted them to the lobby and out into the cool morning air of Collins Street. Because the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, required time to process the complex fraud charges, they were not handcuffed immediately. They were detained, questioned, and ordered not to leave the city. As soon as the officers stepped back to secure the evidence, Lachlan and Chloe turned on each other. The toxic foundation of their marriage, built on stolen money and shared arrogance, fractured. Lachlan screamed that this was all her fault, blaming her for the shell company and the medical documents. Chloe lashed back, calling him a pathetic coward who could not provide a decent life without begging for handouts. They stood on the public sidewalk, tearing each other apart, until Chloe hailed a passing taxi, leaving Lachlan alone on the pavement. He watched the car disappear into the dense Melbourne traffic, finally realizing that the only person who had ever protected him was the father he had tried to destroy. I watched from the elevator lobby, turned my back on the wreckage, and stepped into the car with Aaron, leaving them in the ruins of their own construction.